From the levellers to those who trespassed at Kinder Scout, ordinary people are the ones who change history.
This is our liberation.
And also those joining us on the live stream today, welcome to this celebration of Jack Mundey and of the Green Bands movement. What a pleasure it is for me. My name is Camille Barbagello. I'm one of the coordinators of the COP26 Coalition to be able to host this event this afternoon, I'm sorry. In terms of, we're here at the COP26 in Glasgow, where there is an urgent debate and discussion happening both across our labour movement, but also across the climate justice movement more broadly, about the kinds of strategies and tactics that are needed to bring about the kind of system change that's required to actually confront and tackle the climate crisis. Today's celebration is in memory of a trade unionist from Australia called Jack Mundey, and it's hoped that the inspiration and the courage and some of the incredible stories from that period in Australia's trade union history will help to inspire and uplift our discussions here at COP26 and in our movements going forward. Today, we're going to hear from 3 speakers from Australia. The internet is a wonderful thing, which means that they're not in fact here, but will be joining us on the live stream. And then we've got some speakers also joining us in real life. Jeremy Corbyn will be up on stage, as well as Sean Sweeney from the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. So I'm going to pass over now to a short film that we've made in honour of Jack Mundey, and we'll join you back on stage in this hybrid IRL Australia-Britain event that we've got running here. Thank you very much. Over to you, Arden.
There are many thousands of people throughout this community who have expressed their gratitude. They can do something about the environment in which they live.
I think that the Builders Labourers Union were unique in putting environmental concerns on the agenda.
The things that happened in my life, the green bands were the most important because it brought together the enlightened middle upper class together with the progressive working class around issues that hadn't been raised before.
Some people seem to have this irresistible urge to tear down and rebuild. There's a lot of money to be made. Hotels, office blocks, high-rise. The developers make a fortune, the laborers make a living. The workers, the ones who build the monuments, then tear them down again. All in a day's work. But for 5 years in the 1970s, the builders' labourers of New South Wales called a halt, took the centre stage. Call it what you will, they made history. Like thousands of others, I got involved with this union. In one way or another, we were swept up in what became a powerful social movement, when the builders' labourers put the environment and people ahead of their own jobs. And it was all the more extraordinary because it sprang from the least expected of places.
Union leader and environmentalist Jack Mundey has died in Sydney. He was 90. Labor MP and former President of the Legislative Council, Meredith Bergman, joins us now from Sydney. Meredith Bergman, welcome. It's a sad day for you. Jack Mundey was a big union figure and he also became a very prominent public figure. Tell us how that happened.
Well, Jack came down from the Atherton Tablelands to play football for Parramatta and, as he says, failed at that and so became a builder's labourer. And in the 1950s he joined the Communist Party and started to think about the environment and also about how the workers, the builders' labourers, could be socially responsible for their own labour. And he really is, he's the father of urban environmentalism. He did bring to the world really that whole ideology of being responsible for your own labour.
Hi, my name's Meredith Bergman. I'm a Green Band activist from 50 years ago. I got arrested defending some of the builders' labourers' green bands with Jack. And then my sister and I wrote this book, Green Band's Red Union, The Saving of a City, which is sort of the text about what the builders' labourers did. Now, it's really good to talk about Jack. He really was an inspiring union leader and the person who brought the idea of workers' responsibility for their actions and environmental protection, trade unions taking environmental action to protect the city heritage. One of the things I found terribly interesting about what Jack did with the builders' labourers was that he fought to democratise the union. It had been a complacent, right-wing union, semi-corrupt. He and a group of rank-and-filers fought very hard during the 50s and into the 60s to take the union over. And by 1968, he became secretary. And then he fought very hard to get members involved in union activities, and particularly the huge migrant workforce. It was a very, very high non-English speaking workforce in the builders' labourers at that time. And so Jack organised for there to be migrant organisers and, of course, translators at all union meetings. He instituted something really important, which was limited tenure of office, that union officials could only do 2 terms in office and then would have to go back onto the tools. This was not popular with the other unions, but the builders' labourers did do that, and Jack actually carried that out. He tied the organisers' pay to the Building Industry Award so that the union organisers were not seen to be better paid than the men and women that they were organising. And also, of course, the organisers didn't get paid during industry strikes. You know, they went without money as well. Everyone knows about the green bands, which held up. There were 54 separate green bands in the 1970s, which held up $54 billion of development. That's in 1970s terms, money terms. So it was hugely important, and it saved most of the inner city of Sydney and many of their great historical buildings and many of their great green spaces, such as Centennial Park. They came under huge attack, of course, from the mainstream media and from the most of the politicians, except, of course, for the left of the Labor Party. And, of course, Jack was a member of the Communist Party of Australia. He had joined that in 1957. And but the onslaught from the ruling class against what Jack Mundey and Joe Owens and Bob Pringle and the Builders Labourers were doing, the onslaught was terrible. They've all rewritten history now, and even the Sydney Morning Herald comes out and says, oh yes, the Green Bands were wonderful. But they wrote 5 editorials in 12 days calling for Jack and Joe and Bob to be jailed because they were communist rat bags. Jack always talked about the Green Bands as he referred to the enlightened middle class and the enlightened working class coming together to work for a better living environment. Because of course, most of the resident activists were middle class, and but Jack also saw another very important thing was that the working class had the right to live in the inner city, and of course it was that period where the middle class were moving into the inner city and the working class were being forced out. And Jack saw saving those working class homes as being very important. And sometimes the Builders Labourers were attacked for what would be seen now as identity politics. But they were always very class oriented. They knew that it was the working class that they were defending in a lot of these fights. But of course, they were also famous for supporting women. They supported women in the workforce in the construction industry. They'd have strikes to make certain that women got jobs in what was really a very highly paid industry. They supported a women's studies program at Sydney University, put a ban on the university until the women's studies program went through. They put a ban on Macquarie University for having expelled a homosexual student. One of the residential colleges had expelled a homosexual student, and so Jack and the Builders Labourers put a ban on. And when you think about it, this was in the early 1970s, and it was really a very socially progressive thing for a labourers' union to have done at that time. And of course, the union was very, very supportive of Australia's Aboriginal population, our First Nations people, and they were responsible for what is often called Australia's first urban land rights claim, which was the handing over of what was called the block in the very Aboriginal area of Redfern in Sydney. And the young Aboriginal activists were incredibly supportive of the Builders Labourers because the Builders Labourers had been very supportive of them. Jack was personally absolutely delightful. He had a razor-sharp intellect. He could charm the birds from the trees. The media loved him, strangely, even though they were very opposed to a lot of what was being done at the time. They loved having Jack on television to explain it because Jack really was such an articulate and able supporter of the political position that he was taking. Another thing that the Builders Labourers and Jack were very involved with the anti-Vietnam movement, the anti-apartheid movement. One of the Builders Labourers president, Bob Pringle, was found guilty of cutting down the goalposts during one of the Springbok games. And Jack was very involved in left politics generally. But he also was very pragmatic, Jack. He knew that he had to have a good working relationship with the Labor Party because he was clever enough to know that the green bans were really a blocking operation, that they were going to stop this overdevelopment occurring, they were going to stop the green areas being devastated. But they could only do that for so long that eventually the Labor Party would have to step in and be involved in the solution. And that's exactly what happened. The State Labor Party, which was elected in 1976, bought 900 housing department houses in Glebe, and so saved that cityscape. They saved the rocks, which is really the oldest part of colonial Sydney. And of course, when the Whitlam government gets elected in 1972 federally, also a number of things changed. And as a result of the green bans and Jack's political activity, we now have in New South Wales the Environment Protection Act and the Heritage Act, which both come in a couple of years after the green ban activity. So, as I always say, Jack was very, very important in Australia, but he was also really significant at an international level too, because he showed what trade unions could do when they wanted to be involved in saving the environment.
The 60s were the years of affluence, transition, and opportunity. Large foreign corporations, finance companies, insurance companies, and banks, many of them ripe with profits from the American war effort in Vietnam, were speculating and diversifying. Money flowed without regulation towards the promise of huge profits. Australia was tempting. Down under possessed a buoyant economy, high interest rates, an undervalued currency, and last but not least, extraordinarily amenable politicians. The Conservative Premier of New South Wales, Robert Askin, who was soon to become a multi-millionaire, welcomed the powerful business interests that would reshape the central heart of Sydney forever.
It was a period where builders and developers have been making record profits. Buildings were going higher and higher. New dangers had been coming into the industry. And also it was a period where, because of the new heights, we had to develop skills far in excess of anything that we'd ever envisaged. Skills that no other tradesmen on the sites had ever possessed and were going to possess in that period. And our wages remained static. Well, we'd been the second-class people in the building industry, and we knew it, and we didn't like it. We did the shit work, we would be the first on the job, and of course we'd be sacked before everyone else. It was quite common to give us 2 days' work. Just as soon as the trench was dug, out you go. Let's go through the same thing again, read a herald, hope for the best, try to get in before your mates got the job.
By May 1970, they decided they'd had enough. They downed tools and went out on strike over wages and more money for their skills. They used a new tactic in this strike, the vigilantes, roving groups of rank-and-file workers ready to challenge any strikebreakers or scabs.
Groups of us BLs had been coming into the office of a morning, meeting and going out in small groups to see that no jobs were working. It became obvious after a few days that the builders had in fact woke to our tactics and were putting scab labour onto jobs in larger numbers. At one historic meeting, we decided that we were not going to be outnumbered by scabs. In fact, we would go out in mass. So from there on, 50 or 60 of us would go out at a time. Our own destiny was, for the first time, was in our hands.
I'm Sally McManus, and I'm the Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. I only knew Jack when he was well into his retirement, being a union leader a generation before me. But in a sense, you could not grow up in Sydney and be a trade unionist and not see and experience the legacy of Jack everywhere, whether it be our beautiful gardens, bushland, streets named after him, or the pride of our trade union movement. Jack was what we as trade unionists are at our best. visionary but grounded, mindful but militant, democratic and principled. Most of all, never limiting the ambitions of working people by drawing boundaries on where such ambitions should start or end. Jack was what all deeply principled people who believe in the collective good are before their time. It is not that they're looking forward, it's just that their deeply held principles of justice for all apply whatever the time or the circumstances. The dignity of the working class does not stop with economic justice. Green bans were about the dignity of all of us. Defending and protecting housing, bushland and green space is about the dignity and well-being of all of us. Pink bans were about the dignity of all of us. These values are enduring and far-reaching, but it takes a deeply principled leader of courage to apply them, especially when facing the condemnation of the ruling class, of the Murdoch press, the powerful and the state, despite being arrested, by being publicly denounced and having your union deregistered. There were big personal and short-term prices to pay, but the long-term achievements are there for us all to see in the beauty of our city, on every building site and in the hearts of every Australian trade unionist and in every environmentalist. Ballet, Jack Mundey.
The New South Wales Department of Main Roads wanted to build 350 miles of freeways crossing the city in 6 directions, all converging on the city centre. Freeways had already affected the rocks in North Sydney. People from all over came together to stop the next stage, the Northwestern and Western Expressways. They would have evicted 80,000 people.
And if we let this freeway go through, it's going to go through the whole of Glebe and Redfern and Chippendale. And the people on low incomes who can't afford to buy their own homes are going to be forced out further and further into the outer suburbs.
These houses were the front line. After that, row after row, community after community would be knocked down, scattered, and destroyed. The BLF placed green bans on all inner-city freeway construction.
How would you describe your husband, Jack, to someone who didn't know him?
Well, he was an extraordinary union leader. He was for me, he was a very nice person, somebody that I admired greatly, but because of his politics and his humanity and all of the things that he stood for, but he was an extraordinary union leader. He went into the union, between football matches, really. He came to Sydney to play football and then joined the Builders Labourers Union only to find that the conditions and wages and the amenities were non-existent or disgraceful, actually. So he became part of the rank and file of the union. The rank and file team eventually won the election in the union, got rid of the old corrupt leadership of the union. And Jack then became a full-time organiser, and then acting secretary, and then secretary of the union. In the first instance, the union leadership did something, as they'd promised when they were the rank and file team, did something about the wages and conditions of which were appalling, and the safety record was abysmal in the union. So they did something about all of that, but they also created a very democratically run union. There were a lot of migrant members. They had union meetings where they the members were all welcome to come and encouraged to come, and large numbers did, and they had migrant interpreters there so that people felt part of the union. They involved the membership in everything that happened, and the union officials were, I think, much respected because as well as achieving so much for the workers, they also had the same wages as the workers in the industry. They also, whenever there was strike action taken, the officials got no income as well. So they were also without income when there was a strike on. And I think it was that background's important because when they started to undertake some other like human rights and environmental actions later on, the membership was with them. And without that strong relationship between the union leadership and the membership, it wouldn't have been possible for them to engage in the sort of things that they did. And so that when Aborigines were on strike in the Northern Territory, they brought down a couple of members from the Gurindji tribe to Sydney, and they took them all around the building sites to let workers in Sydney know just what was happening with these Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory who were still being paid in rations. And so they brought them down to go around the jobs, and it just seemed the right thing to do, and it was consistent with Jack's views. They also supported they actually, as well as environmental issues, they also supported gay rights. There was an issue at one of the Sydney universities, Macquarie University, where a student was expelled from university housing because he was gay. And the gay community asked the union if they would take action. Actually told the university then that they would not continue any building work on that university unless and until that student was reinstated. So they did that as well. But they're mainly known for the environmental actions that they took. That started when a group of women in a well-heeled part of Sydney went to the union and asked them to support their campaign to save some bushland. And the women were listened to by this union. They'd been to the government, they'd had petitions, they'd done everything that they could think of to try and save this bushland without success. And then they went to the union. The union said to them, "You'll need to call a public meeting so that we know that it's got strong community support, what you're proposing." So a meeting was called, over 600 people came to the meeting, and the union then agreed that they would put a ban on any building work on this bit of bushland. That was at a place called Kelly's Bush, or it's Kelly's Bush in the suburb of Hunters Hill, which is a fairly exclusive area in Sydney, and that later on became a green ban. It was at first called a black ban, then it became a green ban because that more accurately portrayed what it was about, that is, an environmental issue. After that happened, the union was inundated with requests for all sorts of assistance. And the second ever green ban was at a place called East Lakes, which was a much more working class area. They heard about Kelly's Bush. There was a bit of parkland left. There was a lot of development going on at East Lakes, and a bit of parkland was left, which was supposed to remain parkland. Next thing, building material arrived and was being placed on the parkland. The people in that area went to the union. The union again said to them, "Call a public meeting to show us that you're supported by a large number of people in the area." Again, the public meeting was held. A large number of people came to the meeting, and the union agreed to put a green ban on. That, I might say that park has just been renamed Jack Mundey Reserve in honour of the fact that it still exists, and it only exists because of that union putting on a green ban. Some of the bans were placed to hold something there. Most of the bans remained, and still remain actually, they're still there. But one of them, for example, was to try and save the Theatre Royal. That was a theatre in Sydney that had been built in the late 1800s, and there'd been a theatre there since that time. That was to come down, a huge new development was going up on that site, and the theatre community came to the union and asked them to put a ban on that demolition. So the union spoke to the developer, and agreement was reached. So a ban was put on just to hold things until an agreement was reached with the developer. The developer asked the architect to incorporate a theatre. At first the architect said that can't be done. The developer was supportive of what the union and the arts community was trying to achieve. So they did incorporate a theatre. That's the Theatre Royal, and so there's still a Theatre Royal because it was incorporated into the new building. They were also asked to save a church, the Pitt Street Congregational Church, which very few members of the Builders Labourers would have been attending that church in the city. However, they again asked that a public meeting be called to indicate that there was wide public support for it, and there was a large public meeting, and the union agreed to put a green band on, and the Pitt Street Congregational Church, the building still stands and is still a church building.
Tell us how the green bands spread beyond Australia. Tell us about the Birmingham.
Well, the Birmingham Post Office. Jack was invited to speak, to lecture at the London School of Environmental Studies, and I was with him on that trip overseas. And when we were in London, it was actually Spike Milligan who wanted to do something about it. The wonderful old Birmingham Post Office was to be demolished and a building was to go up there. And some people were very disturbed by this, by an historic building being destroyed, demolished, and so more destruction of history, or heritage at least. Anyway, Spike Milligan's mother lived in Woy Woy in New South Wales, north of Sydney, and he used to make visits out here to visit his mother, learnt about the green bands when he was here. So he was back in England and he wanted to meet Jack and talk about the Birmingham Post Office. So we were introduced by an Australian who was in London at that time and who knew us and knew Spike Milligan. So we had dinner with him, and he talked about the Birmingham Post Office, said, would you come and have a look at it? And so that was how the Birmingham Post Office ended up being saved. Jack met the then union official called Pete Carter, and a campaign was waged by the building unions, and the Birmingham Post Office stands today as a result of that green ban. So I don't think there were many others in England. It wasn't like here where there were green bands placed not just in New South Wales and Sydney, but all over Australia. Actually, there are buildings still standing, and in fact swathes of suburbs, like where a freeway was to go through a suburb, and a ban was put on preventing that from happening. There were many individual buildings as well, of course, and in things like, Centennial Park in New South Wales, where there was a plan that they would build a sports stadium on Centennial Park in the hope that they could get the Olympic Games some years hence. And again, there was a huge public meeting about that, and so that there was a green band placed and Centennial Park was saved. At the Opera House, they forgot about building a car park until later on, and then they decided that they'd put it under the Botanic Gardens, and that would have meant removing 3 100-odd-year-old fig trees. The union was asked to put a ban on, which they did, and those fig trees were saved. Later on, with more expertise or greater technology, they were able to put a car park in. At first, people had to go by bus from a car park that was removed from the area and get a bus up to the Opera House, but then with new engineering, they were able to put a car park much closer to the Opera House, and that exists now. But those trees, those fig trees, still exist in the Botanic Gardens, the Outer Botanic Gardens. So yes, there've been many green bans. So it was a pretty extraordinary union. It also allowed women into the industry for the first time. So no, I suppose I have some bias, but I think he was a pretty extraordinary person. Yeah.
So thinking of his legacy, Jack's legacy, and the fact that he built these unusual, powerful relationships with communities for the defence of the city and the natural environment. What do you think his legacy teaches and asks of union leaders today when they think about climate change?
Well, of course they've got a role to play. The Builders Labourers was able to do a lot of what they did because they had a very, very high level of membership. Something like 90% of the people who worked as builders labourers at that time were members of the union, and there was a building boom going on. And there was this very close relationship between the leadership and the membership of the union, far more than existed in other unions. Although it wasn't the first union in Australia to take political action. Of course, during the Second World War, wharfies refused to load ships with pig iron to go to Japan. That was a political action. Workers refused, after the Second World War, workers refused to assist the Dutch when they wanted to recolonise Indonesia. So there were other political actions taken, but today's unionists would have a fairly difficult task because there are not nearly as many in the union. But it seems to me that where unions can show that they stand for issues that are going to benefit the community, then they win support by doing that. And so on climate change, obviously, it's probably the issue now that needs to be addressed. And so the union movement hopefully will take a much bigger role in trying to do something about that, including, for example, by where argument is made that, we can't shut down coal mines because it will take away jobs. Well, organise other jobs to be done by those workers, and the union movement needs to go to those workers with proposals about what sort of work they could do, obviously working with other people to develop plans about that. But that was the sort of thing that the union did. They talked to workers about why the Vietnam War ought to be opposed, for example, in Australia. That meant having meetings on jobs where there was discussion about the war, and workers were asked to join moratorium marches, stop work to stop the war. But those things were the support of the union members was only won by having meetings with them and those issues all being thrashed out. And sometimes it took more than one meeting, of course, but eventually workers joined in. And again, with the anti-apartheid struggle, again, that was discussed with workers on the job about opposing racially selected sporting teams coming to Australia. That was another issue that was won, with the support of course, a lot more than union members with that one, but it was supported by that union. And again, they talked to the membership of the union about why they ought to be opposed to apartheid in South Africa and what we could do to stand against that. If Jack were here today, I'm sure that he would be arguing that climate change is the main game in town and that workers are going to be disproportionately, the working class of this country will be disproportionately affected by the changes that'll be wrought if we don't do something more about climate change. And therefore the union movement needs to involve, encourage, talk to members of unions, talk to workers about what they need to do to prevent any further disaster from climate change, because there is no doubt that we've already, and we've seen what's been happening in this country with dreadful fires, the worst probably we've ever seen, and with floods and with and with oceans rising, and so workers need to be involved in campaigning against climate change.
Thank you so much. I'm really so pleased to welcome Jeremy Corbett and Sean Sweeney onto the stage with me. As I said before, my name is Camille Barbagello, we've just watched a film and heard from three incredible women in Australia, including Jack Mundey's wife. I just wanted to kind of indicate some of the breadth and the depth that we've heard from the film, and just to quickly go over the fact that in the 1970s, a trade union was focusing on migrant organising, was democratising the union, had language translators at union meetings, implemented limited tenure, tied his wage and other organisers' wage to the award, to the average, and then went on, after having fought tooth and nail on building sites across Sydney to raise wages and conditions and to talk about the dignity. My family also come from the building industry in Australia, and the slogan, "We built this city," definitely comes from the legacy of the Builders Labourers Federation and is the proud sticker of the CFMEU, the union that the BLF merged into. So after fighting, my contribution today is I want to talk about two things, and then I'm going to pass on to other speakers. I want to talk about two things that weren't raised in the film today. And one of them you'll find in the book that Meredith was talking about, which is Green Bands, Red Unions, which talks about leverage. And I want to talk about the concrete pour. Because I think it's one of the probably the most incredible short examples that really indicates to us the power of the working class. But not just any old power, power that we actually have to really think strategically about how we bring bosses and capital and government to heel, and to heal really quickly. So really quickly, as you saw in the film, Sydney was in a building boom. There was more concrete going up and around Sydney than we'd ever seen in colonial history in Australia. As you saw there was some pretty amazing health and safety moments going on. Blokes and women riding around on cranes and bits of material without a shred of protective gear or safety gear. And the concrete pour went like this. When you were fighting on a job and you wanted to have your demands met, you'd raise them time and time again, and because of the boss, they refused and batted people away, and they weren't getting anywhere in terms of fighting for decent wages and conditions for members. So as you saw there, concrete was a very manual thing. So the concrete pour was a tactic that was delivered to win demands immediately, and that was that they would lay half of the concrete, and then they would walk off the job for a health and safety reason, and they would tell the boss, you've got 15 minutes until that concrete sets. If you don't meet our demands, which are very reasonable, we won't go back onto that job for half an hour, because we've legally got the right to hold a union meeting for half an hour to discuss health and safety reasons, which basically meant the boss had one of two choices: to spend millions and millions on digging up concrete and having their whole building process brought to the end, or meeting the workers' demands. Now, that's an incredible understanding of how you win and how you win fast. And I think that there's something in that for everyone. We're not all builders labourers, right? Just like we're not all fossil fuel workers, but we are all workers, whether we get paid a wage or not under capitalism. And we all need to think about what our concrete pour is. In all of our jobs, what is it in our jobs that will make the bosses heal and come to the table and start listening to our demands and treating us with the respect that we deserve? And how is it that we can take that moment of leverage and then think about the ecological question that we're faced with in terms of climate change? The other point that I want to make today, before I pass over to two people who are also going to talk about their understanding of the green bands and also what it means today, was that Jack Mundey was defeated from within in many ways, and that it is necessary to have a think about our movement and make sure that we're able to build strength in our movement to not be able to be divided and toppled. Right-wing forces within the union colluded with bosses and government to ensure that the BLF and the leadership under Jack Mundey and others were driven out of the union and deregistered. They were also blacklisted and they never worked again in the industry. And so I think it's a telling tale in terms of the need to think about division, the need to build solidarity, and the need to really think about where our enemies are and how we actually approach conflict as well, and to not be complacent. And that the fight ahead is going to be a very difficult one against quite serious forces around the finance industry, around the banking industry, about how capital operates. And capital is on the move, right? The change is coming. It's a question of what change. And so I think the legacy of the green bands tells us a few things that I've raised today. And I'm really so happy and proud. I just want to quickly tell you how this event came about. Jeremy and I were doing an event at the World Transformed on winning climate justice. And I had, in my speech, mentioned the New South Wales BLF, and I made a joke that said, if you don't know about the New South Wales BLF, then you probably haven't had a beer with me, because if you've had a beer with me, I would have probably told you about the New South Wales BLF. And Jeremy shared a story with me after that event that he suggested that we do this memorial for Jack Mundey here at COP26, because what more fitting place to really rethink the legacy of the green bands than here whilst we're talking about the largest crisis, an intersecting crisis that we're facing today. So it's with great pleasure and thanks that I hand over to Jeremy Corbyn.
Camille, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. And for those watching online, you're most welcome here in Glasgow. The weather in Glasgow is nothing like the weather ever is in Sydney. I think we can all agree on that, I'm sure. Jack Mundey was inspirational in so many ways, and I first came across him in the 1970s when we had an organisation called the Institute for Workers' Control, which was campaigning for industrial democracy. And it was based in Nottingham, and we had huge conferences and events and had a big influence in a lot of union discussions, particularly with the late great Tony Benn on democracy in the workplace. And I was indeed part of a group that wrote a plan for the democratic running and control of the British Motor Corporation when it was brought into public ownership under Tony Benn as industry minister at the time. Audrey Wise, who was also a Labour MP for Coventry at that time, she later became MP for Preston, was a shop worker, campaigner within the Shop Workers Union, and also strong believer in peace, democracy, and in environmental sustainability. She was way ahead of her time in environmental thinking. And she talked about the green bands, and she talked about Jack, and brought that whole knowledge and experience. And when Jack visited Britain to see Pete Carting, who also knew, he had a very big effect, because he brought with him that experience of what he had achieved, not he, what the whole union had achieved in environmental sustainability in Sydney, and not the place you would obviously think of as being sort of number one on the environmental agenda, but they did succeed at a great deal. And I liked the way the film started with tear down and rebuild. Well, buildings are usually built to last at the most 60 years. And that is a very short time, and most 60 years, many last much less than that. And as formerly a councillor and now a member of Parliament, I've seen buildings built in the 1960s and 1970s knocked down, something else built, and there's something else knocked down, and something else built yet again. So you're looking at the third or fourth building on that site in a period of sort of 50 years. And then you look not much further away, and you see buildings that were constructed in the 18th, 19th, and early parts of the 20th century that are still there, are doing fine, and are going to be there for very much longer. The amount of energy consumed in construction is absolutely enormous. The amount of energy consumed in preparing concrete is absolutely enormous. Whereas the energy required to reclad, refit, repurpose buildings is minimal by comparison, and the skill levels are very high or even greater than the skill levels required on new building. So it is a question of looking at our thinking on building and our thinking on the environment. And I think that's what the green bans taught us. They also taught us that groups of workers organised strongly together can protect and defend the environment in concert with the communities most affected. And I love the way the thing transposed between the wealthy parts of Sydney and the poorer parts of Sydney. And the building workers were there alongside because they wanted to ensure there was open space in the future for their children, their grandchildren, and their grandchildren's children, because that's the way a lot of people think. Public open space is something that's very, very important and very, very precious. And once you lose any kind of a park, you never, ever, ever get it back. It just simply doesn't happen. And so that kind of environmental protection is important, which leads me on to the whole point of what we're doing this week in Webster's and what we're doing all together as our project, as many others, is about how we deal with the environmental crisis that we're facing at the present time. There's a huge issue of global warming, of the need to go away from fossil fuels towards renewables. There is the whole issue of pollution of rivers and oceans and what that does and comes back to us in the food chain. And there is the whole issue of air pollution and loss of life as a result of it. But it's also about how we view the world and society. Because if you view it solely by tear down and rebuild, to quote the film again, and have no consideration for the environmental consequences, then we're not going to achieve net zero. We're not going to achieve that sustainability. We will continue destroying pristine open spaces, reducing biodiversity, and ultimately it will affect all of us if it's not already doing that. So it is about empowering people, understanding the power of lobby, and not so far away from here at the COP26 Centre, there are probably as many environmental lobbyists as there are people who are lobbying on behalf of the fossil fuel industry, because they're here in big numbers, because they recognise that some of their interests are at stake in all of this. And so getting that message across is very important. The last point I make, and it's a very important one that you just made at the end of your contribution, Camille, is about democracy in unions, political parties, and in our lives and societies. Because Jack was attacked by the Murdoch media. I can empathise with that. The Murdoch media are not kind, and they don't intend to be. They're there for a purpose. They're there for a purpose to protect inequality, injustice, obscene levels of personal wealth, and fill everybody's heads up with celebrity at the expense of serious debate, discussion, or rational thought. And they will go for any individual and call them all kinds of terrible things until they've been so demonised that their message is confused with the demonisation of the individuals. That's what the right-wing media do all the time. But there is an alternative, and that is to defend the principles that people have fought for, defend the principles of the union, and above all, strengthen the democracy in unions, political parties, and in our life. Now, democratic accountability can actually be very uncomfortable. It's designed to be. That's the whole point of it, that those in office are held to account by those that elected them to that office. And Jack was ultimately defeated by the machinations of the very big union bureaucracy, by the pressures of the media, and by the influence of extremely right-wing forces. But was he defeated? There's no park in Sydney called Lobbyists Park. There's no public open space called Fossil Fuel Way. But there are places named after Jack Mundey. He's the one who's remembered. He's the one who gave a lesson to people. And it's up to us, sadly he is gone, but it's up to us to take that pattern forward. So when we're talking about the kind of society in which we want to live and the kind of cities and towns we want to live in, before you start building, look at what is there. And look at the communities that are there. And I'll finish with one slight anecdote. I came to be elected to a local authority in the 1970s from opposition to the wholesale demolition of 4 streets in the ward that I was later elected to represent. The infinite wisdom of the council at that time, it was a Labour council, was that we demolished those streets because the houses were in very bad quality, and we would replace it with concrete and glass and steel and so on, deck access flats. Now, I'm absolutely in favour of building council housing. Absolutely, totally in favour of building council housing. But council housing doesn't necessarily have to be built. It can be in existing properties. And so we campaigned for several years on this issue. And the council was determined to knock down all the buildings, refused to repair any of them, and then announced that they were in dangerous condition because nobody prepared for them. Okay. The two things are kind of connected. Anyhow, eventually we won it. We won it through a public inquiry, legal actions, and so on. And all those roads were rehabilitated. And with it, the communities that lived there. And what happened in the campaign was people that were living in private rented flats, the very small number who were owner occupiers, those that were tenants of the council in poor quality property, and those people from different communities all over the world came together because they liked the community they lived in and defeated that proposal. And that is, look at what you've got, look at the community, look at the buildings. And buildings, places, towns, cities, high streets matter in our lives. It's not just the function of going to the high street to go to a shop. It's also to meet friends, it's also to be part of a community. And if you just destroy everything, keep replacing it with access, sort of gated communities, locked in and all the rest of it, you're destroying communities. I think he was way ahead of his time, was Jack. He obviously learned his skills on the football field, transferred them to the building industry, and transferred all that brilliance to inspire many more people on how we can build an environmentally sustainable world and not destroy this beautiful world that we've got. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's my great pleasure to also introduce Sean Sweeney, who coordinates Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which is a global network of 64 unions in 22 countries. TUAD, which is what the acronym reduces down to, advocates for democratic control and social ownership of energy resources, infrastructure, and options. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Camille. It's great to be alongside Jeremy. We were on the same stage in Paris at COP21 6 years ago now. Jack Mundey, I had the privilege of meeting Jack in Sydney like perhaps 5 years ago. Comrades from the region, Don Sutherland and Paul True. Paul True was living in England and he's a close friend of mine, and he told me all about Jack. And long before I was even really getting into the environment or climate change, I was very impressed by this idea of green bans. It resonates across the global trade union movement and environmental movement as being a sort of a way of engaging community and doing the right thing for the longer term in the way that the movie describes and Jeremy just articulated. And I think though this other question that you raised, Camille, about the sort of the darker side of trade unionism around building stuff. And the joke in the US is that the building trades will build their own gallows if it was done with a project labor agreement, or they will pave over the Atlantic Ocean as long as there was prevailing wage standards. That's a bit of an exaggeration, of course, but we are in a struggle, not just in the building trades, but across the whole trade union movement for that heart and soul, the spirit of trade unionism that Jack exemplified. The other person who I think, when I was watching the film about Jack and reading about Jack, I was thinking of Tony Mazzocchi, whose name has come up several times in this, around the COP and around the trade union events. Tony was he really was the person behind the just transition. Importantly, though, Tony didn't see just transition as a safety net for workers who were affected. Like, let's buy off some workers or give them some compensation. He saw it as part of a more transformative agenda for change. He was a socialist as a teenager. He signed up, he grew up in Brooklyn, where I live now. He signed up, lied about his age, and served in World War II at the Battle of the Bulge to fight fascism. And very similar to Jack, he was red-baited by his opponents, but he won the election for the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. The Red Scare came again, he lost, but he won it back. And he sort of retired in office and went on to do lots of work on the environment. So there's so much, these characters, Jack Mundey, Tony Mazzocchi, and many others who are nameless, who subscribe to the same vision of trade unionism are, as Jeremy said, they're timeless. Their influence will be timeless on future generations. On this question, though, I remember about 10 years ago now, it's almost exactly 10 years, there was a big fight in the US over the Keystone XL pipeline, which was a pipeline from Alberta, Canada, the tar sands, down to the refineries in the Gulf of Texas. And it was going to go 1,700 miles across some very ecologically sensitive areas, including in Nebraska, a very large aquifer, one of the largest in the world. And we got a bunch of unions together. It was called the Labor Leaders Platform on something, I can't remember. We started it when I was at Cornell University. And we said, there are 4 unions that have signed a project labor agreement and are pushing in Washington, D.C. to get the State Department to approve, that was under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the time, to approve the project. We have to do something about this. And they said, well, we can't, because we've already, this agreement has been signed, and it's a done deal, it's going to happen. And there was a massive movement of young people, indigenous people, and unions began to break away from that thinking and show some degree of steadfastness and courage to stand up against their own brothers, if you like, in the movement. These were the transport unions, the nurses unions, who stood up and said, no, we want to have a vision of society where workers do not have to make a choice about building this horrific project and having a decent job. And I remember the Washington Post ran a headline saying, labor split on Keystone XL pipeline. And that to us was a victory, because it was a done deal and they thought it was going to happen anyway. But there was a piece of this where one of the unions, I won't name them, who signed the project labor agreement to build the pipeline, one of the regional organizers called me up, and he was my student at Cornell Labor Studies program a bunch of years ago. He said, Sean, I got a big problem. I said, what? He goes, I got to fill a busload of guys and take them out to Washington to support the Keystone pipeline. I said, oh. And he said, and nobody wants to go. He said, so we're going to have to give them a day's pay and guarantee them overtime. And, you know, I don't feel good about it. I'm on your side with this, but, you know, unfortunately, this is jobs for the members and we're going to get grief if we don't do it. And so on the way, the demonstration went ahead in Washington in favor of the pipeline. And then I got a call from him and he was on the bus coming back. He goes, you'll never guess what happened. I said, what? He said, our members started mixing with the youth and indigenous people and other trade unionists, and they came back and said, we're on the wrong side of this issue. It's not, we thought we didn't know anything about this pipeline. We were going down fighting for jobs, and we realized we're fighting for a project that is going to help destroy the planet if it goes through to completion. And that pipeline was eventually stopped. It took us 10 years to stop it, and I'm not saying we've had that many victories. But I think the moral of that story is leaders sometimes will do what they feel they need to do for members. Their job is to keep members in work, especially in the building trades, which is project by project. There's no permanent employment situation. But if we appeal to the members and talk about what's at stake, we can move everybody on the side of the vision that Jack Mundey and Tony Mazzocchi and many countless others have tried to do in terms of this vision of a more progressive and enlightened trade union movement. I'll conclude with one point. There's a union here in the UK, General Municipal, GMB, of course we all know them very well. They've got a very pro, in many ways, some would say a very pro fossil fuels position. They believe gas is forever, and we joke about it with them. But some of the activists from the COP came down to their picket line, and someone said yesterday, after the march, I have never seen so many GMB flags on a demonstration. And so I think there's, again, another example that as a movement, as a combination of social movements, we can put forward a vision of social transition and transformation that can protect workers and the climate equally, and protect our ecosystems in a way that can be truly sustainable over the longer term. And I think that if that vision's put out there in clear terms, I think we've got every chance of winning this battle. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Sean. I wanted to just acknowledge and also say thank you to the Peace and Justice Project. At the beginning of when I was employed to be the COP26 Coalition Coordinator, I set about working with Stephen and Sam, who are our trade union representatives on our coordination committee, and we set up a trade union caucus as one of the first things that we did as part of the coalition, because we were determined that when we mobilised on November the 6th for the Global Day of Action, that we would try to turn out the largest visible mobilisation of trade unions at a climate justice demonstration. And I think we did pretty well. Stu Melvin, I'm going to definitely name you and thank you on the internet and here in Glasgow for all of the work that you put into building the worker and trade union blocks. We had over 191 actions in the UK on November the 6th. And at 12 of them, there were massive worker and trade union blocks with banners, with flags. And here in Glasgow, during COP26, the GMB have been on strike. And we're starting to see what Sean was talking about, which is the potential that happens when young people, when environmentalists go and join picket lines. Because picket lines are some of the most transformative spaces that we can ever hope to do political education. It's so much faster and easier to make the arguments to people on a picket line and to move through some of the divisions that we still have when we're in struggle together. So we need to keep mobilising. The question now is not, if we've only got around 10 years to get this in the bag and solve it, we can't think that we can only mobilise millions of people once a year. We need to escalate, and we need to be prepared and confident to move out on our own and not just mobilise when there are things like COPs happening. But we also obviously need to mobilise on the streets together. November the 6th was a unity demonstration where we tried to bring together as many social movements as we possibly could: feminist, migrant, Indigenous groups, community groups here in Glasgow, workers, trade unions, feminists. We put a